What's up, good people of the world? Welcome to episode 2 of How to Orchestrate Like John Williams. So today we're going to be looking at Adventures on Earth, which is a cue from the film E.T. the Extraterrestrial by Steven Spielberg. I'm sure you've all heard this score many times. It's one of my personal favorites, and if I had to pick a favorite John Williams score, honestly, it would probably be it. It's hard to pick favorites, but it just has so much, especially in the last 15-20 minutes of the movie, it just has so much brilliant orchestration, transitions, thematic material, of course. The tunes get stuck in everybody's head, and there's a lot of thematic material. There are like some 10 melodies throughout this score, and just especially in this very last, Adventures on Earth is what we're going to be looking at today, and it's a concert suite version of the last 15-minute bicycle chase from the film, which is just a masterclass on orchestration. All the different textural setups. He uses so many advanced harmonic techniques, so many techniques of melodic development, and lots of different texture changes, and there's some ingenious, really well put together score. This is the excerpt that we're going to be looking at today. It's measures 118 through 125. You have the score. I'll put the link in the description where you can purchase the score for yourself. So even though it's a fairly simple setup texturally, again, there are just lots of little details about the way that he scores this in terms of dynamics and texture placements, voicing, registers, the way the melody interacts with the bass line, the way it's harmonized, what instruments he chooses to give that to. It's just a marvelously constructed little 8 bars. But before we get into the score, as usual, let's go ahead and check out the melody and the harmony. Alright, so there are a lot of really cool things about this melody. Firstly, even though it's a short, simple, catchy 8-bar tune, it exists in 4 different keys at once. D-flat major, C major, B major, and D major. Right? So firstly, what makes that easy to sing and very memorable despite modulating, it seems like it's kind of haphazard to modulate all over the place within the course of the melody? Well, the way he constructs it is quite ingenious. He uses pivot notes to get from D-flat Lydian to C Lydian, and to get from C Lydian to B Lydian. So, for example, if we look at D-flat major, D-flat Lydian, basically any D-flat major mode, in this case it's Lydian, the C acts as the major 7 of D-flat, and it also exists as the tonic, of course, of C major, right? So if we just play the melodic cell by itself, that in and of itself can exist within the key of D-flat major, so it's not like we're having to shift to a weird chromatic note to get to the C. It makes sense because it's just sort of scale-wise motion, but then once we get to the C, of course the harmony changes to C major, and now we're in C major, so that's what allows us to continue in C major. With some exceptions, most of the leaps in this melody, actually all except one, return back down by stepwise motion. But the inner phrases, or so if we split the melody into sort of 4 parts, we have very simple. So what makes that easy to sing? That's a big major 7th leap. That's pretty difficult to sing, one of the more difficult intervals to sing. What makes it easy? Well, it's the fact that it uses an anticipation and sort of re-emphasizes the note. Right? If we were just to go jump back down, or do something else, if he didn't re-emphasize the note, it'd be very difficult to sing. But it's the fact that he goes, it allows us to sort of get up there and then reinforce it. And then we, of course, can sing the C, because we were just added a second ago, so it exists in our recent musical memory. So that's what makes this melody really easy to sing, despite, again, the modulation, which can be sort of thought of as like a planing thing. But another thing I like about this melody, both harmonically and melodically, is the fact that it's pulling in 2 directions at once, right? We have this, we're going up, and then down, and then even higher, and then back down again, even lower, and then even higher, and then down low. It has this ambiguous pull between going lower and going higher, and it's really interesting to see a melody sort of expand outward, because most melodies have a ascending contour and they sort of fizzle downward, or a descending contour and then they sort of work their way back up to tonic. But this melody has a very interesting way of pulling outward and going lower and then higher and then lower and then higher. It's quite ingenious in my opinion. And another thing that's really nice about not just this tune, but all of the tunes in E.T. is the way in which he dresses it up harmonically by using inversions and interesting harmonic substitutions. But in this particular melody, it's inversions. So if you listen to these melodies by themselves, you could almost consider them to be a little bit cheesy, right? Just playing them by themselves, but he never lets it get into the cheese territory by just sort of giving them blanket accompaniments like a lesser composer might give them. The way in which he takes these themes and gives them a life beyond just the notes that they have prevents it from getting into cheesy territory. And the example from this melody is the fact that he uses first inversion chords. Now, there are several technical reasons why inverted chords work much better for this melody, rather than just going like... First off, that gives parallel octaves between the melody and the bass line. And even though nowadays we don't necessarily dogmatically say, oh, parallel octaves or parallel fifths or perfect consonances in general are bad or objectively wrong, they certainly have a colder sound as opposed to imperfect consonances like thirds and sixths. So in this case, the fact that he uses inverted chords makes a really nice minor sixth interval between the melody and the bass line, which just has a much richer sound. And it also gives a sense of, I think, suspense and anticipation and not being a fully resolved root position chord, which adds to the sense of propelling forward in this particular moment in the score. And another thing is it works very symbiotically with spelling out the harmony melodically, right? Because you want to very clearly spell out your harmony. You don't necessarily just want to rely on the block chords and the rest of the orchestra to emphasize the chord that's playing underneath. So if we look at the first four notes of the melody again, and we look at the bass line, what does it do? It spells out a perfect D flat major 7th chord in first inversion, right? Whereas if we just had a root position D flat chord, we'd be missing the third, right? Which would give us a colder sound. So the inverted chords here is just a little touch, just a little detail that adds all the difference and just really takes it to that next level emotionally, as well as giving it a richer sound. And just thinking about the relationship between your melody and your bass line is incredibly important. And using inverted chords to make your bass line more melodic, as well as creating an ebb and flow between root position chords and inverted chords, which have a bit more tension, is something that the great composers of old, and I say that not just Williams and Eric Korngold and but Holst and Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov. This is an incredibly important concept, and it's something I think that's direly missing from a lot of film music today, where they just have root position chords all the time. So in E.T., all throughout this entire cue and the whole score is a great example of root position chords and the way that the melody interacts with the bass line. So I would encourage all of you to really think about your melody and your bass line and how they can work together symbiotically. Because the bass line, because of the overtone series, it is the most important, next to the melody, or second to the melody, it is the most important line whenever you're writing a piece of music, because it affects everything above it with its overtones, right? And the lower you get on the piano or on any instrument, the more these overtones get out of dog whistle territory and come into the natural human hearing range, and they really affect the sound. I don't want to get into like a rabbit trail here, but like one example would be like the minor sixth, right? The lower we play it on the piano, it starts to sound more and more dissonant, right? And that has to do with the overtone series. If we look at this minor sixth right here, and if we go down here, if we build the overtones, let's say like E, first overtone is an octave, second is a fifth, right? And then we look at the C, right, and its first overtone, right? We're getting this minor second interval or minor ninth interval, and that is harder to hear up here because it's in dog whistle territory. But the further you move down on the piano, the more you can hear those overtones conflicting with each other, and that's what makes this interval sound dissonant lower on the piano. And that's one reason, again, not to get into a rabbit trail here, but that's why fifths and octaves sound so pure, because they line up with the lower end of the overtone series, so you can play them down low and they're not going to create muddiness and clashing up in the upper partials. But anyway, I digress. The last thing that I want to talk about in regards to the basic materials he has for this melody is the accompaniment, right? So two things are cool about this accompaniment. Right, Firstly, it's a sort of story. It helps to tell the story because it's a direct has a direct rhythmic relationship to the bad guy theme. Right, I'm sure you remember that from the film. He's usually played on muted trumpets. So the fact that he has that serving as the rhythmic accompaniment helps to sort of let us know as an audience that, oh no, the bad guys are right behind us, you know, like, because remember, this is playable. They're all on their bicycles trying to escape to E.T.'s ship. So it helps to tell the story, and it also works very symbiotically with the melody, right? It only emphasizes the melody on beats 1 and 3 to give a basic pulse. Other than that, the rhythm of the melody and the rhythm of the accompaniment happen at different times, so it's a very complementary relationship. I'll play it slowly. Right, so you can see that they have a sort of back and forth conversational, which is what helps this to have so much forward driving motion, even though it's just two simple ideas. And that concept, again, is used throughout pretty much all of the accompaniments that John Williams creates for his melodies. One other small example would be like Star Wars. Again, a lesser composer might do something like... Right, they might make the accompaniment the same rhythm as the melody, which gives it a fairly dry, sort of blocky sound. But what does he do? No, he goes... finally does get to a moment where they both happen simultaneously, it's for a point of emphasis, and it has more impact because of the fact that they've been sort of, you know, and that type of like making things sort of happen at different times and then they come together for a climax. That contrast is a very, very useful technique. But anyway, I'm rambling at this point. So anyway, so yeah, even though it's a simple piece of thematic material and it's a simple accompaniment, everything just works really, really well with each other, and it's just it fits. It's like clockwork. It's just an excellent construction. So even when you create something simple, make sure that you use every musical technique at your disposal to increase the emotional impact and catchiness of that structure that you create. Because if you can come up with a really good bass structure, you know, a good bass line, a good melody, a good counter line sometimes, you know, and a good rhythmic accompaniment, once you come up with those, then when you go to orchestrate it, you know, it's not like the orchestration does itself necessarily, but it's much easier to make it sound rich and full in orchestration if you come up with these good, well-working together ideas ahead of time. Anyway, but on that note, let's go ahead and check out and see what Williams does with it. All right, so let's dive in. So first we'll go ahead and play it one more time just to see how note performer handles it. Alright, so before we look at this in detail, I just want to clarify again that for the purpose of these score videos, I'm always going to use concert pitch score, non-transpose. So this horn, you see a D flat, and it's an actual D flat sounding. Same thing with trumpets, you know. I think those are also the English horn is a transposing instrument as well. But anyway, so the note that you see on here is the note that's actually being heard, just to make it easy for you guys to see what the actual pitches are. So sorry if you're an actual horn player or trumpet player and it's bothering you. Anyway, so what does he give the melody to? So this is very interesting. So first he gives it to the first and the second violins, both playing in this low chocolatey register. Now, let's look at all these markings here. So firstly, the bowing is meant to make it sound as smooth as possible while accommodating the dynamic level. So you'll notice that he has it at fortissimo. Now I think this is an ingenious touch right here, because in the lower register of the string instruments, they're very warm, they're very resonant, but they're not going to be particularly piercing, right? So if he tells the lower strings, the lower register of the string instruments to play at fortissimo, you're going to get a very rich sound. In addition to this, he marks sul G, which means to play on the G string. So rather than, you know, starting on the G string and then string crossing to the D string or the A string for a higher note, they're playing it all on the lowest string. This makes a couple of things happen in live performance. One, it makes them play with portamento, because, you know, rather than just switching from, switching to another string or something like you would on a guitar, they're having to slide up to the note, and you can see this in the video. Right, do you see them sliding up to get to that note? That portamento gives it a very expressive sound, which is inherent in the way that he's written it. He doesn't even have to write a portamento, and they do it automatically because it's all on the G string. And this also gives it, again, a very rich, resonant sound that it wouldn't have if it was played on the D string. Because, you really can't think of string instruments as just one instrument. You have to think of it as like 4 instruments in terms of sonority. You have the G string, the D string, the A string, and the E string. And each one of them has its own characteristics and its own relative range. So if you're playing high up on the G string versus low on the D string, it'd be like, me singing this note, which is like, that's a high because I'm a male. Whereas if an alto or a soprano sang that note, it would sound much lower relative to their range. So notes, the resonance of notes obviously changes depending upon range. So my point is, with string instruments, you can't just think of, the violin has this range. You need to think of what string are they playing it on, and how high or how low on that string is it, because it's going to affect the timbre of the sound. And when you're writing melodies that aren't particularly high, because you don't want to write on the G string and then write something really up high, that there's a certain point where it becomes unmanageable. But within I would say within an octave and a fifth range of the G string, so like G all the way up to D, an octave and a fifth above that G, that's fairly comfortable if it's not too difficult a key. This is a fairly difficult key, but it's the recording we're using is the Boston Symphony, and the recording in the movie is the London Symphony, so he knows they can play it. But it's fairly slow, so it's not that difficult. But in any case, so this is a technique that you can definitely use in your scores, and it really adds to the richness of the character. And of course, he writes espressivo to let them know that they can play with extra vibrato. But I think it's interesting just the fact that he has them at fortissimo. And you look at some of the other dynamics in this. He has violas mezzo forte, right? He has there's a lot of dynamic variety. The brass instruments are at mezzo piano, and we'll get to the dynamics later, but he puts the strings on fortissimo, so they really pop out, and they're the main thing. They just pop right to the forefront, but it's not too much volume because they're in that chocolatey register of the sort of lower sound, but in playing high up on the G string. So it just gives a really rich sound. And then to complement the sound, and I think it's part of the reason why he has the violins on fortissimo dynamic level, is the fact that he has the horns playing along with him. He doesn't use all 4 horns because that could quickly overpower the violins. He just gives 2 horns to give a sense of richness and to really add to the sound. So the horns are excellent blenders. And they just really, really work well, whether doubling cellos or doubling violas or doubling what violins are doing an octave below. Williams very, very often will take 1 horn, 2 horns, or sometimes all horns, and when he wants extra string power, he doubles it with what the strings are doing. And as long as you're careful dynamically, which he is here, because he only uses 2 horns and he keeps them at mezzo forte, it can strengthen the sound but it still sounds like the violins are playing, right? An untrained ear would listen to this and they wouldn't necessarily hear those horns in the background. I just want you to know that this is very difficult. This boom, it's slow enough that they can play it, and great horns can play it, but it does involve some shelving, right? So with brass instruments, they're based on the overtone series. Besides the trombone, brass will, and some other instruments, most brass instruments have pistons, right? So basically what those pistons do is they change the length of the tube, so it changes which overtone series you're using, right? So because you're basically using a bunch of different overtone series, and you get different notes. There are certain notes that you get out of this overtone series, certain notes you get out of this overtone series, and there are different choices too. Like, I don't want to get into this too much in detail, but there are some cases where you have like a note that could be produced with this overtone series, but it's a little bit sharp in this overtone series. It's more in tune in this overtone series, but technically it might be easier if they did that. So it all depends on context. So that's why a lot of times, keyboard players, and I say this as a pianist, often don't have a good intuitive sense of the difficulties of playing on a non-keyboard instrument, because you play something. First off, you can play something in any octave on the piano, and no matter whether you play really high or really low, it's the same difficulty. It's not any easier or any more difficult. Whereas changing the relative range of a brass instrument or a string instrument or a woodwind instrument, and it completely changes the difficulty. The fingerings change. and the overtone series, or where it's placed within the overtone series changes. But anyway, the point that I'm getting at here is that this jumping, making a big leap, it generally involves shelving on a brass instrument, which means that rather than, they can't just switch a piston to get to that higher note, they actually have to change the rate of buzz that their lip has on the mouthpiece to actually switch to a different partial in the overtone series in combination with the piston needed to achieve the overtone series that they need. So it's like a vertical, let's hit a certain note of the overtone series and let's get the right horizontal overtone series based upon the length of the tube. And they also use their hand in the bell to help with intonation. But you can talk to a real horn player and they'll tell you all about the technicalities of this. But anyway, so my only point is just be aware that if you're writing for like high school players or college orchestra, writing a big leap like this is pretty difficult. But with great horn players, it sounds fantastic and very 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 expressive. And again, when you don't just copy and paste, you'll notice that he has a quarter and a dotted half for the violins, but he gives the horns a little eighth note rest so that they can, if you just wrote a dotted quarter and just did a big phrase marking, they probably would breathe anyway, but he really wants them to have plenty of breath for the next phrase. And I just noticed that I actually, I notated this incorrectly. This should all be under a single slur. So just be aware of that for the second part, because I copy and pasted. But anyway, so the horns in combination with the violins playing high up on the G string, that constitutes the melody, and it just has a really rich, warm, stringy, but reinforced with the horns sound. It's a really nice touch how he adds this little eighth note. He doesn't go ba da da ba da boom. He doesn't just have another quarter note here, but he da 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 da. Just that little change to the melody helps to propel it forward and give it some variety, because the structure is so, the first phrase is so symmetrical to the first phrase is so symmetrical to the second phrase that little bit of variety. And again, little things like a little crescendo with an accent mark lets them know that they can push for certain moments, and it helps to give the phrase some structure. So now let's look at how he divvies out the accompaniment. So the first thing that he does, which is really nice, so this first hit at the beginning is leading in from the previous section, but with the bones here, he has this really nice crunchy major seventh chord, right? So you'll notice here, besides this first chord, which again is a hit from the previous, if we look here, you see an A flat, D flat, and you see the C right underneath, right? That's a really nice crunchy sort of chord, which might be a little bit muddy on another instrument, but the trombones overtone series is very much like a saw wave. It has a lot of upper partials, so that the fundamental C is not going to be particularly muddy. So it works. Those types of major seventh crunch chords work really well on trumpets and trombones, whereas it might sound muddy if he had the tuba playing that C, right, rather than the trombone. So he wants a sort of raspy sound, and he clears it up. He only has the major seventh chord on the downbeat, and then it basically just turns into the bass note, which is of course F or D flat because it's in first inversion, right, and then D flat. So that's how that works. And notice this is a moderately controversial notational convention, but he beams over rests. I think it personally makes it easier to read, but you'll notice that in order to give a sense of the 12/8. Oh, which reminds me, I should let you know, this is probably not making any sense to you. The way that the metric, this is metrically divided up in the score. Really interestingly, he notates 12/8 for the trombones and the bass trombones, and anybody playing that dum dum da da dum dum rhythmic figure to make it really easy for them to read, and then he notates everyone else in 4/4. And it doesn't make a problem for the conductor, because conductors at this tempo usually would conduct 12/8 da 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 da. They would conduct it in 4/4 anyway. So it just makes it easier to read for those particular instruments. It might cause, I don't know, it might cause some problems in certain instances if you're like, on beat 3 or beat 2 or the second, if we're talking about rhythmic things. But the nice thing is that of course, Williams is conducting himself, but it's that way in the score as well as the parts. So there's not any discrepancy. I think it makes it easier to read, but there are some music engravers that don't like beaming over rest. They think that it's ugly looking, but functionality and readability over aesthetics any day of the week, in my humble opinion. But anyway, and another thing, again, the nice thing dynamically is that after this first hit, he has them play mezzo piano, right? Which is he very much micromanages the dynamics all throughout, because remember, he was the conductor of the Boston Symphony for years. So he has a very good intuitive sense of how loud instruments are relatively. If you write mezzo forte for everybody, it's not always going to balance out, and very often it's not a good idea. With certain exceptions, if you place registers really well, it's not a good idea to give everyone the same dynamic level. You don't need to like overdo it, but you need to, I think mezzo piano is a very good decision here, because with the little accent marks that he gives and the fact that they're trombones and they're raspy, they're gonna pop out, and so they're going to be heard. But the mezzo piano, if you wrote mezzo forte, they might distract from the melody a little bit too much. So anyway, these by themselves sounds like this. Just switching downward with the planing motion. Really, really nice. And a nice little touch here with the English horn. He does a lot of good English horn work, some solos and all kinds of... He makes very good use of the English horn in this all throughout this cue and the whole score. But he adds the English horn in just for the second half of the phrase for a bit of variety. And it's really nice. It's in the mid-high register of the English horn. If we turn on transposing score, you can see that that's where it is, sort of relative to the English horn's range. It's something that, since the English horn is a double reed, it's gonna pop out of the texture in a way that a single reed or a flute would not. So it's a really nice, if we just play this along with the trombones, you'll notice that it can be heard quite nicely as a little bit of extra pop. And this little grace note here is really nice too, the Lydian grace note. Bum 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 bum. And he puts them at forte, and then has them crescendo, implied crescendo to fortissimo, and then back down, which helps balance them out with the brass instruments. So the trombones are at mezzo piano, the English horn and its mid-high register at forte. That's going to balance well. So again, you really need to familiarize yourself with, and I think Korsakoff has a good sort of relative dynamics chart. And I have a good chart somewhere on my computer. I might be able to link that in the description if I can find it, to where like one horn is half the dynamic level of a brass instrument like trumpet or trombone, or the flute in its lower register is, you really need to familiarize yourself with the relative to the range of the instrument, the dynamic capabilities of all of the instruments, because, in order to make things balance well, you have to micromanage dynamics. And but in just studying Williams scores gives you a very good sense of that, because you listen to it and you're like, well, that balances well, and then you look at the score and it's like forte, mezzo, piano. Wow, that's Anyway, check this out. Right, so you can see that it's about the same dynamic level sonically as the trombone when he marks it forte, and the trombone gets mezzo piano. And then it changes to a really nice concertino trumpets. Concertino means with mute, so it has a biting sound that really pops out for the first note. Dum, 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 dum. And then he brings the bones back in for the second half. So the trombones are basically just doing exactly what the trombones are doing, but an octave higher. And I've said this in some of my other videos, but the trombones range works exquisitely, doubling what the trumpets are doing an octave lower. The golden register of the trumpets and what the trumpets are capable of doing in regard to range is basically the exact same as the trombones, but an octave above. So you can be confident that if something is in a good range for the trumpets, it'll work well on the trombones an octave lower, and vice versa. And then he brings back the English horn just for one bar, really, really nicely. So let's go ahead and play all that accompaniment by itself. So you can sort of sort of hear it. So again, even when you just have a simple accompaniment, by shifting instruments around, adding a little instrument here, doubling it, shifting it from trombones to trumpets, and then bringing the bones in again, you can take the simple melody and accompaniment setup that you have, and with orchestration, really give it, you know, a sense of subtlety and life and an organic quality that helps keep it from being too repetitive or too simplistic. Right. Really, really nice. So, and then let's look at what he has down in the lower string. So basically just reinforcing. So the violas are really nice. They're pretty resonant down there in their lower register. The violas are normally the quietest string section because, well, not in the case of like film scores because they can, you know, or like a symphony orchestra where they have lots of violas and higher. But they generally tend to be not as many violists just in the world in general as there are violinists or cellos because it's a difficult instrument to play. It requires a fairly large frame to play well, and the numbers that it has in the orchestra isn't usually enough to compensate for the fact that its body isn't large enough for its lower register, meaning that, like, you know, cello is much larger than violin or viola, and it's not that much lower than the, you know, it's only an octave lower than the viola, but it's like many times the size. So the resonance of the cello helps to make up for that, and you know that's why string instruments, in order to balance, just like on a piano, where the lower notes have one string, and then the middle notes have 2 strings per note, and then the higher notes have 3 strings per note, in order to balance out the sound. That's why, you know, symphony orchestras generally have, like, you know, 2, 3, or 4 double basses, maybe 6 to 8 cellos, 10 violas, 12 second violins, and 14 firsts. It's a dynamic balance thing, but in this case, I basically what I'm doing is I'm justifying his use of divisi here, because normally you wouldn't want to, to compete with fortissimo in the upper register, you wouldn't want to use divisi for viola, but I think mezzo forte is a good choice. The fact that they're playing tremolo repeatedly gives it a sort of shimmer to the sound. He doesn't want to pop out, he just wants to give it a nice pad. And the fact that they're on the really lower register, they're very nice and resonant down there, you know, I think it does balance really well. You can hear it in real life. So it's just something that, again, you might not necessarily notice, but when you take it out, you know, it's a very, very noticeable. Right, and notice how, again, these little range things right here, once he gets down to C, this C down here is the lowest string of the viola. He can't go any lower to get to the B major chord, so he just inverts it and then puts the 5th here and the tonic here, right? And then he moves back down to D major. Switches the octave. And then down to D. Right, and he writes divisi here, right? Div period is an abbreviation for divisi, meaning that he doesn't want them to play double stops where they're using 2 strings to play that. He wants to split the viola section in 2 halves and have half them play the upper note, other half playing the lower note. So we'll go ahead and play that in combination with this other accompaniment that we have going here, and you'll see that it really adds a nice pad underneath. So, and in real life, they'd probably be a little bit quieter than that because no performer is not compensating for the divisi. In other words, no performer is acting like there are 2 viola sections playing rather than splitting it up like it would be in real life. So they'd be a little bit quieter than that. The other nice thing is this rhythmic motive, which is something that Williams uses a lot of his scores whenever he has like a 4/4, 12/8 triplet, you know, or 12/8 feel or triplet 4/4 feel. He uses this in hook. Da 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 da. It gives a really nice sense of propulsion. So he has this in the cellos. Right. And it's just emphasizing this D flat tonic here, and then the lower note is just playing the low bass note, which is the inverted chord. And the fact that these are 6th intervals means that they're really easy to just finger on 2 strings, and then you just have to move your bow back and forth. So it's not like he's having to finger each note. Da 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 da. It's just you're fingering this note and that note, and then you can just move your bow. And you notice he micromanages the bowing a little bit right here, right? He lets them know with the slur and the staccato marking, it's da 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 da. So that he wants them to start a down bow and up bow. And you notice this is generally what happens. He marks it just for the first measure, and then you don't need to then mark it for every single measure after that, right? You could mark simile, but usually that's something you do with articulation markings. If you mark SIMILE, or SIM period is the abbreviation, that is usually for articulation markings. So if you write, like, for example, like these staccatos and these slurs, or like marcato, a certain marcato figuration, certain notes want to be accented, then you would need to write simile when you took the marcato away. Because they would otherwise assume that when you take the marcato away that you don't want any marcato anymore. But it's different with bowing, because they're going to have to bow it regardless of whether or not you have bowing markings there. So that's why he doesn't need to mark simile. You just mark bowing for first measure, then take bowing away, and they're going to assume that if the figure remains the same, then you want it to be bowed like that consistently. So, and then the other nice thing down here is pizzicato contrabass. You know I love pizz contrabass. He has it fairly high up in the register, doubling what the cello's lower note is. So you have the roughness of and the rhythmic vitality of the cello, and then you have the nice pluck of the contrabass. And again, contrabass, I say again because I've said this in lots of other videos, the contrabass's pizzicato is incredibly resonant and lasts almost as long as playing a note on the piano. And it's very, very commonly used to sort of add a nice, rich heartbeat to the music, so to speak. And he uses it all across all of his scores, and other composers use it as well. So the upper pizzicato, like first violin, second violins, that tends to die away pretty quickly. You play a note and it just sort of dies, pluck, pluck, and it's not as dynamically loud, but pizz on the bass works really well, especially because a lot of times the contrabass has difficulty initiating a note attack because the strings are so large. They have to play. It takes a second to start the note. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But so, for example, you couldn't take this figuration and just give it to the double basses down an octave below. It would just be mud, right? Because the scratchiness of them having to initiate the note that quickly is difficult to do with such a large bow and such large strings. And sometimes, in order to get a note to attack quickly, they'll even lightly pluck it, believe it or not. So that way the note is already vibrating, so that when they go and play it, it's easier to sort of begin initiation of the note. But anyway, so my point is that plucking is an instant attack on the bass, and there aren't any problems with articulation with plucking. So, and you'll notice that he gives this little, it looks like a tie or a slur to nothing, but it's basically just, it's usually marked as L period, V period. I can't remember what that stands for, probably some Italian term, but it just means let ring. It's something you could normally use for like timpani or cymbal, and it just means that he doesn't want them to, because if you just wrote like quarters, they'd probably play it and then mute it, right? Play it, mute it, play it, mute it. But he wants it to sort of ring out, for them to pluck and it ring out. So that's a really nice, easy, aesthetically non-busy, for lack of a better word, way of playing that. And again, the dynamics are very well placed here. He has the cellos at forte, the contrabass at forte with the pizzicato. He has this pad at mezzo forte backing off a little bit, but still mezzo forte, not mezzo piano, so that it can compete with the brass. Then he has fortissimo for the melody and this rich tenory, G string espressivo, and then he has the bones and the trumpets at mezzo piano. And then he has the horns, mezzo forte, doubling what the violins are doing. So very well placed dynamics. And you'll notice that the trumpets are mezzo forte because of the fact that they have a mute, right? I guarantee that if he didn't have a mute, he would mark them at mezzo piano like the trombones. But the fact that they have a mute makes them a little bit quieter. So he ups the dynamic level 1, and so that they can be comparable to the trombones. So that all works very well. So let me go ahead and play that accompaniment just without the melody by itself. English horn, trumpets, trombones, and viola pad, cello rhythmic activator, and contrabass. Just really, really nice, and it just works perfectly with the melody. live recording one more time. The only last two things that I want to mention is the fact that the reason that he doesn't want to... if you wanted the melody to be very, very legato in the violins, why not just have like this whole first phrase slurred? The problem with that is that it would make the second measure an up bow, right? So it'd be ba-da-da, ba-da-da. So it would give a sort of larger phrase structure of down bow attack and then down bow attack, right? So he avoids that and sort of gives each measure, the downbeat of each measure, a down bow, in combination with the fact that, if you remember, there are two ways of achieving dynamics on a string. One is pressing down harder, which is going to give you a rougher sound on this, pressing down harder on the string, and the other one is using more bow, right? So usually a violinist will decide which one of those is the best way to achieve more sound. But in this case, because of the fact that it's a very light, lilting, legato, espressivo melody, the violinists are going to want to use more bow rather than pressing down harder on the string, because it's going to give you a more velvety sound. So Williams compensates for that, and that's why he does very short bowing, and it only does 2 notes per bow stroke, so that they can use a lot of the bow, and you can see they use a lot of it to get that fortissimo sound. Right, and over here he has them do all of that under the same bow stroke, right? Because the note is just being held still. So then they're going to pick up their bow and start again on down bow here. And that's not something that you need to write, because they're just automatically going to know when you start on a new phrase. Instinctively, they're going to know to switch to a down bow. You only really need to mark bowing, again, like I've said before, when it's slightly unclear. Anyway, but that's pretty much it. So yeah, it's a great little excerpt, just really well scored. I find it really interesting how he takes these two simple ideas, and again, just the way he adds a little bit of English horn, or he uses the muted trumpets, or the voicing, or the fact that the harmony is inverted, or the fact that the first violins and second violins are doubling each other on the G string and fortissimo, but then the horns are mezzo forte. It's just, you can tell that he just has so much experience with these instruments, and he knows, and what's amazing is that he, as you guys probably all know, he writes this at the piano, right? So he has such a good internal ear, and he's listened to so much live orchestra, and by the time that he wrote this score, has had so much experience orchestrating and writing scores for live orchestra and conducting them and hearing them, that he just immediately knows, in order to get this sound in my mind, I need to use these registers of these instruments and combine them in this way and use these dynamics. So, so part of that is score reading, so you can see all these dynamics written out, and then in conjunction with listening to live orchestral recordings, and especially not, that's why I love like a lot of the hybrid modern film scores today. Like, there's some really cool stuff being done, and I have nothing against it musically, but if you want to write for live instruments, it often doesn't give you a realistic view, an intuitive internal ear of the balancing of real instruments, because there's so much mixing fader stuff happening. What I would recommend is go to your local symphony orchestra and listen to them, or listen to great recordings of the great symphonic works, like Daphnis and Chloe, or Scheherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov, and just absorb the sound of a real orchestra and just get a sense for how instruments blend and how loud they are, and relative to their range, and develop that intuitive sense. But anyway, I hope you guys got something out of this video. Thanks so much for watching. We're definitely going to be doing more Harry Potter cues and more ET cues. We might move on to Star Wars for the next episode. I'm going to try to change up the movies every once in a while to keep it interesting. But also, if there's a specific cue, let's stick it to John Williams for now. If there's a specific cue that you like, that you vote, that you want me to analyze, feel free to let me know in the comments. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next video.